David Tilman is both a theoretical and an experimental ecologist, and has spent most of his career developing theories of biological diversity and testing them with field experiments. His work over the last few decades has helped to shape ecology into an increasingly quantitative and predictive science. However, another major focus of his research explores how managed and natural ecosystems can be sustainably used to meet human needs for food, energy, and ecosystem services. Dr. Tilman is the Regents Professor and McKnight Presidential Chair in Ecology at the University of Minnesota. Minnesota? Is that how they say it out there? Excuse me. And he's the director of the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, which is an NSF-funded long-term study site. He's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, and was the founding editor of the journal Ecological Issues. His many awards include the Ecological Society of America's Cooper Award and its MacArthur Award, the Botanical Society of America's Centennial Award, and the Princeton Environmental Prize. Dr. Tilman has written or edited 5 books and published more than 200 papers in peer-reviewed literature, including more than 30 papers in the world-leading journals Science, Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The impact he has had on the field of ecology is nothing short of immense. He was the world's most highly cited environmental scientist for the years 1990 to 2000 and 1996 to 2006. In an article that he published in Nature in 1998, he wrote, quote, "It is not clear which are greater, the successes of modern high-intensity agriculture or its shortcomings. The successes are immense. Because of the Green Revolution, agriculture has met the food needs of most of the world's population, even as the population doubled during the last 4 decades. But there has been a price to pay, and it includes contamination of groundwaters, release of greenhouse gases, loss of crop genetic diversity, and eutrophication, i.e. pollution, of rivers, streams, lakes, and coastal marine ecosystems. It is unclear whether high-intensity agriculture can be sustained. The search is on for practices that can provide sustainable yields, preferably comparable to those of high-intensity agriculture, but with fewer environmental costs," unquote. Dr. Tilman wrote this at a time when evidence for the human role in global warming was still highly controversial, and before there was the serious worldwide moves toward the production of biofuels that we see today. As I think you will hear, the issues and trade-offs of high-intensity agriculture may actually be much more difficult than he described above if we must also replace a substantial fraction of fossil-derived energy with agricultural fuels production. Dr. Tilman is among a small group of ecologists that have been sounding the alarm that many of the popular visions for production of biofuels may have very serious environmental shortcomings, especially when considered from a global perspective. But he also offers some concrete ideas for how to do it right. So tonight, Dr. Tilman will talk to us on, and I think it's right up there for you to see again, thank you, Getting Biofuels Right, the Biofuel versus Food and Environment Dilemma. Let's welcome Dr. Tilman to Oregon State.
I'm just delighted to see all of you here. It's my honor to be here and to be able to talk with you and share some of my thoughts with you. And I'm hoping that you remember that clock is 5 minutes shy at around 10 o'clock tonight when it's time for you to ask questions. And would you guys lock those doors? I want a captive audience. Well, as I saw people coming in here and all of you in the aisles, it reminds me of the time when the devil came storming into a church one night. And he ran up and down the aisles and he frightened all the parishioners but one woman from the church. She just sat there calmly looking at him, studying the situation. That really bothered him. He came up to her and demanded to know why she wasn't frightened. She said, "Well, for the last 30 years I've been married to your brother." Well, what I want to say, I'm talking to you tonight about a problem that society is married to. There are 6 billion of us, heading toward 9 billion. We face some serious issues that we have to deal with. But I don't want you to go running out of this room frightened by that initial statement and the quote you just heard. I want you to sit here, study it, and so on. I'm going to tell you a lot of details tonight. The devil is in the details, and so I would assert are the solutions. I'm going to show you a graph of human population size and how it has grown. And you will see this dramatic increase has happened from the time when agriculture was first invented 10,000 years ago to the present time. And the point I'm going to make is that we as a society have needs for food, for energy, and for a livable global environment. And that these needs are coming into conflict because there now are 6 billion of us. We are having our food, energy, and livable environmental needs come into conflict right now. But the real conflict is growing in the next 50 years into what will be a major conflict. And it's growing because of two things. First, there will be 50% more people. We'll grow to about 9 billion people, and all the evidence suggests we're going to level off at 9 to 9.5 billion people, which is very good news compared to 15 or 20 years ago. But second is that global per capita income, when you control for constant buying power of currencies, is projected to increase about 140%. So we're going to have 50% more people consuming 140% more per person about 50 years from now. That is an immense increase in the impact of society. It has major implications for how we might be able to provide society with the food, energy, and a livable global environment that we need if we want to give future generations a quality of life that we have. Look at what we have done as people. Isn't that amazing? Look at that graph. 8,000 years ago, we discovered agriculture. Now we've gone from, that was not zero. That was a number bigger than zero, but hard to tell on a linear scale, to where we are over there now. And that curve will level off up another couple feet on the ceiling to about 9 or 9.5 billion. So we're undergoing this incredibly rapid change, as I said, and this means that we have some conflicts coming at us. So, I mean, we notice when you pull into a gas pump, here's our typical American car right now, sort of big and long and so on, and gas is $3 a gallon and so on. But the real problem we face isn't really coming from us running out of energy. We have enough fossil energy in petroleum and coal, and we can convert coal into liquid fuels if we want to, coal to liquids, that we can provide society consuming vast amounts of energy, all the energy we need from those fossil sources for the next century or two. The issue is that when we use this energy this way, we release massive amounts of greenhouse gas, as I'll show you in a slide. I want to point out something, though. This says it, so I might as well say it just to you in case you aren't reading as quickly as I'm talking. But just like global demand for energy has doubled in the last 35 years, all the projections are it's going to double again in the next 40 years. And the point I want to make from that doesn't so much do with how we will get enough energy. It's how we will get enough energy that doesn't cause massive changes in global climate. Now, I'm not going to do an Al Gore on you. I only have one slide like this, okay? And all I want to point out is this. You've probably all heard a lot about this. I don't want to bore you with things you know. But here is the last 400,000 years of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. As you know, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's in relatively low amounts in the atmosphere for the last 400,000 years. And then since the Industrial Revolution and the combustion of fossil fuels, we've jumped from there to here, and we're heading for here. These low points were glaciers. These high points are the kind of climate we have right now. And where we're going to be here, where we're going to be here, I am not a climate modeler. I can't pretend to know. But people who do model these things come up with something like this, where the red shows things that are 5 or so degrees Celsius warmer than they are right now. We're heading toward something up here, if we keep doing what we're doing, where we're going to have very likely large-scale climate change that could threaten the very basis of our society. So if you think about this, and people have, one of the solutions which seemed to offer itself was to have biofuels. Now, a biofuel is a wonderful idea, because what plants do is they take carbon dioxide out of the air when they're photosynthesizing. When they're using sunlight, they take carbon dioxide from the air, and with sunlight they're able to turn that carbon dioxide into sugars. And they use these sugars to build the plant material, cellulose is in it, there's a whole string of sugars. They make proteins out of it. They do all their growth based upon removing carbon dioxide from the air and getting it into the plant. Well, the logic that was put forward for the first biofuels was that once you've had carbon dioxide in the air go into a plant, you can take the plant, such as corn from a corn plant or the oil from a soybean, and turn it into a liquid fuel that you can burn in a car. And when you burn it, you'll combust it, and that carbon dioxide will be released back to the atmosphere. So it sounds like you can take carbon dioxide from the air, put it into a plant, and the plant grows, and then put it back in the air, and there should be no effect on greenhouse gas levels in the air. It's a great idea. And if you do it with only the steps I've told you, that's exactly what happens. If you did that just like I said, with no other releases of greenhouse gas associated with that process, that fuel would be called carbon neutral. It would have no long-term net effect on the level of this greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. That's called a carbon neutral biofuel. And that's the idea behind corn ethanol and soybean biodiesel and other biofuels. Now, one of the problems with biofuels is that we need food. Just as demand for energy doubled in the last 35 or so years, so did demand for food. And all the projections are that even though we're only going to have 50% more people 50 years from now, we're going to need 100% more food. Now, why do we need more food? People are becoming wealthier. As people around the world have higher incomes, they eat more meat. It takes about 7 pounds of grain to make 1 pound of cow. And 1 pound of cow, and since about only half a cow is the stuff we eat, it takes about ballpark 14 pounds of grain to put 1 pound of beef on a plate for you to eat. Unless you grow it with grass, which is, I think is a wonderful idea, and if any of you are farmers and have grass-fed beef, I'm delighted you're doing it, because that really is a much better solution. But it's a lot of grain to make meat. Pork is about 4 pounds of grain to make 1 pound of animal. Chicken, about 2 pounds of grain to make 1 pound of animal. The most efficient way to get animal protein from grain, from cereals, is to grow fish. Some species of fish can give you about 1 pound of fish or about 1.2 pounds of cereal grain put into the process. Now that's dry grain going into wet meat in all cases. So it's not quite a miracle. The fish can't just miraculously turn grain into food. But they do have the highest efficiency of turning a grain into a protein. So for people who want to eat animal protein, eating lower down that chain, more efficient animals, can be a very important part of what's going on. These projections are projections doubling food based upon the trends that are seen right now and how human diets are shifting as incomes go up and projected by how much income might change. And that's going to make us need twice as much food with only 50% more people. Well, biofuels are very new. But even now, we're seeing some conflicts that are caused by biofuels. In the United States, because of biofuel demand for corn, and also because of increased meat production around the world, demanding grains like corn that can feed livestock, the price of corn has doubled in about the last 2 years. It's gone from about $2.50 a bushel to about $5 a bushel. That effect doesn't impact many of us in the room, but there are many other people around the world for whom that is a major impact. Don't forget that all grains are internationally traded commodities. When the price of corn goes up in the United States, the price of corn goes up in every other nation of the world. And people who eat corn, such as a food stuff, such as in Mexico, tortillas are a major foodstuff, and poor families spend a very high proportion of their weekly income just buying tortillas. In fact, I read an estimate when the corn price doubled, there were street protests. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times both covered this, and they estimated the typical sort of minimum wage worker in Mexico City spent half of their weekly income buying tortillas before the price of tortillas doubled. So there are some serious issues that occur here when we start pricing food by how much it's worth if we converted it into energy when energy is running $100 a barrel. It makes corn worth a lot more. You can still almost make a profit or just make a profit in an ethanol plant at $5 a bushel corn. But that makes corn much harder as a foodstuff for other people, as well as making meat derived from corn, typical beef, chicken, pork, dairy, and so on, eggs, being much more expensive than it had been before. In fact, you probably know that the fastest component of inflation worldwide right now is in the food sector. Food is going up. And it's going up partly because of biofuels, ethanol out of sugar and so on, biodiesel out of soybean, biodiesel out of canola oil, biodiesel out of palm nut oil, but also because of a shift in human diets around the world toward greater total global meat consumption. Well, if we look to the future, now it's a variety of ways can project this. It looks like we're going to need about 1 billion hectares of land. Now, a hectare is something you may not know what it is. It's about 2.5 acres. So that means 2.5 billion acres of land that is not currently farmed is going to be needed within the next 50 years if we keep having the same kind of increases in yield that we've had during the last 35 years, which has been a pretty good 35 years for food production, if we're going to provide double the food that we provide right now. That amount of land is a land mass the size of the full United States that would need to be taken out of wherever there are fertile soils in an area with enough rain for rain-fed agriculture around the world, which basically means coming out of tropical rainforests and tropical savannas around the world. A land mass about the size of all the United States will need to come out of that to provide food for people in the next 50 years. Clearly, biofuels also need land to produce them. So one of the issues is if we're talking about using biofuels as a way to make up for the carbon impacts of fossil energy and to give us a renewable long-term source of energy for society is there may be massive competition between food and biofuels for the remaining fertile lands of the world. So I want to talk a little bit about biofuels. We wrote a paper, this was lead author in this paper, a guy named Jason Hill, who's a researcher, postdoc working with me, came out about 1.5 years ago, in which we look at the full life cycle of corn ethanol and the full life cycle of making biodiesel from soybeans. So I told you the simple story. Carbon dioxide in the air goes into the plant, makes a fuel, goes back in the air when you burn that in your vehicle. Well, here is the real story. So this green bar here, this is the time when people start running for the aisles normally, when I get to the data graphs. Okay, that's the devil right here, all this data. So this green bar shows the amount of energy in the corn ethanol that comes out in gigajoules. I know it sounds like Back to the Future, right? How many gigawatts are we going to need? You don't watch Back to the Future every week like my son does? Okay. Gigajoules per hectare. Just a certain amount of energy from a piece of land that you get when you make corn ethanol. The green shows the energy in the ethanol. The lighter green above it shows the energy in a co-product that is made. When you make corn ethanol, you have something left over, which is an animal feed. Clearly you use up a lot of the sugars in the corn. We have some protein and oils left over. It's an animal feed. It has an energy value. If you use it to feed animals, you don't have to grow as many soybeans, for instance, and you can say how much energy it takes to grow soybeans, and you get that little energy thing. Here is what it takes to produce it. The, I don't know, pink? What is that color? Pink, good. The bar on the bottom here shows all the energy that it takes to grow the corn. And this is really all the energy. This is the energy it takes to make a tractor, to make this, to get the iron and the steel to make a tractor and convert them into a tractor. It's the energy it takes to run that tractor. It's dividing that energy by how long that tractor lasts and how many acres it cultivates and all that stuff. And by the time you do all of that, the energy in the tractor doesn't even show up on here. But we included everything that was thought to be important. So making and using the tractors, making the combines, the buildings, and so on. Because farmers who grow corn tend to have fairly large farms, maybe 400 acres or so is the average, none of these things here matter. Fuel matters, fertilizer matters, because it takes a lot of energy to make fertilizer. After all, fertilizer is what people make bombs out of, literally. Make seed and pesticides. This is the energy it takes to make the corn that you use to make this amount of ethanol. The bar above here is all the energy it takes to convert that corn into ethanol. It's mainly natural gas and electricity at the ethanol conversion plant. You basically end up with something like wine when you're done. You have to boil it to drive off the ethanol. It takes a lot of energy to boil it and to do that distillation, and a lot of energy all along the way to do all the work it takes. And the actual energy gain, here's the energy you got in ethanol, here's what it takes. The actual gain in the energy is that little sliver between there and there. Can you see the little thing? But because of this co-product, the total gain there, that amount, is 20%. 20% of each gallon of corn ethanol is actually new non-fossil energy. 80% is energy you had to put in to grow the crop and convert it into ethanol. So when you visit a corn ethanol plant and see all the energy leaving, and it really is amazing how much ethanol they produce, you have to keep thinking, okay, only 1/5 of that is actually new energy for society. 4/5, 80%, is the energy it took to make that product. And when you use that energy on the farm and use that energy in the plant, you release greenhouse gases. So suddenly you don't have a carbon neutral fuel at all. And if you look at all the greenhouse gases that come out when you explore for oil, when you drill wells to get the oil, when you pump it from the ground, when you put it through pipelines, put it on ships, truck it across the ocean, refine it, and haul it to a gas station, that's that amount of greenhouse gas per unit of energy, grams of gas per that amount of energy, that it takes for gasoline. That's the carbon dioxide that comes out of it. And here's the carbon dioxide when you do all the same calculations for corn ethanol. It's 14% lower than for gasoline. So it does have a benefit. But when we did these analyses, we didn't really know which way it would go. There's a lot of controversy. We did this. Another person at Berkeley did a similar analysis. We both showed numbers about this, from about a 20% benefit to about a 14% benefit in greenhouse gases. So if you look at corn ethanol, I would say as a first pass, it's a success. It actually shows us we can make a new energy crop which gives us energy. We have a net energy gain, and we have a greenhouse gas gain. The dilemma is the gains are not very large for what it takes. And the real dilemma isn't that, it's this. If we took all the corn grown in the United States, which in 2005 was mainly used for food and feed purposes, and we converted all of our corn into corn ethanol, because we use such massively large quantities of gasoline in this country, it would only, all of that corn into ethanol only replaces 12% of the energy that is in the gasoline that we consume every year. 12% of the energy. And that's not even asking how much of this new energy. When you multiply that by that 0.2, the 20% of the ethanol that is new energy, using all of our corn only gets rid of 2.5% of the actual energy that we're burning as fossil energy in this country, and only that for the gasoline energy. So the actual net gain to society from converting all of our corn in 2005 is only a 2.5% reduction in the energy dedicated to transportation via gasoline in the United States. Soybean biodiesel is much the same. All of the soybeans dedicated to biodiesel gives us a 3% energy gain. We can't live without all the soybeans and all the corn. It really isn't possible for us to do these sorts of things. But because of all the energy that it takes to grow corn as a crop, and especially all the energy it takes to convert it into a biofuel, what we can do from this is a very small contribution to the energy needs of our nation. So right now, worldwide, all the biofuels that we make are about equal to 2% of global petroleum consumption. So biofuels are really a small part of what's going on right now around the world. This is a graph showing what's been happening through time, total biofuel production for ethanol fuels versus biodiesel, but the total of these is only about 2%. So you can ask, if we really want to raise this up to have some significant impact, where are we going to get the land to do this? Where are we actually going to grow biofuels? Well, what's starting to happen around the world in small ways, but ways that concern me if they continue, is that more and more land for biofuels is coming out of existing natural ecosystems. Land is being cleared deliberately to grow biofuels. For instance, in Brazil, in Malaysia, Indonesia, tropical rainforest is being cleared and the land is being planted with biofuel crops. And in Brazil and other parts of the world, grasslands are being cleared, especially in Brazil, grasslands are being cleared to native grasslands in savanna to grow sugarcane to make ethanol. Well, let's look at another thing which affects the greenhouse gas balance of a biofuel. Besides all the energy that goes in to make the biofuel, which counts against the benefit you get when you burn the biofuel instead of fossil fuel, there's another major issue. We call it the carbon debt. We had a paper that just came out in the journal Science about a week ago that led to, let me see, an editorial lambasting us in the Wall Street Journal, one praising us in the New York Times on Sunday, lots of articles. I don't think any of the people read the article we actually wrote, but it led to quite some controversy. And let me tell you the basis of this. If you look at a tropical forest, here's a tree. I had one with my wife standing here, and she's short. I don't have her in this picture. But these are massive trees. Half of the weight of this tree, if you dry it out, get rid of the water, and half of the weight of a typical tree is the element carbon, C. And when that tree is cut down, either immediately if it's burned or later on as the wood from it decays and so on, normally it's about 30 years, you've lost the vast majority of the carbon into the tree as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When you farm a soil, over about the first 30 to 50 years, about 40% of the carbon that's in the soil is lost as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The same thing happens when you go to the savanna habitats, grassland and scattered trees. The carbon in the vegetation is lost, and a lot of the carbon in the soil is lost as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere when you turn native vegetation into biofuels. Well, if you do the analyses, you can say, for a given system, how much carbon is there on a piece of land, on a hectare of land, and how is that repaid by the biofuel that is produced? Because a biofuel does give you energy which can displace a fossil fuel source. And you can ask for all the for all the biomass and soil carbon dioxide that goes into the air when you clear land, how long will it take before that biofuel actually gives you an advantage? Well, if you grow palm in Malaysia and Indonesia on land that had been rainforest, clear the rainforest, ask how much of that carbon goes in the air in the next 50 years, and what benefit do you get from the biofuel, it takes 86 years before the biofuel actually gives you an advantage. For the first 86 years, the atmosphere of the world would have been better off burning diesel fuel than burning the biofuel you make on land that you get by clearing the native vegetation and releasing all the carbon in it. If you grow it, as is commonly the case, in low-lying rainforest land where there are peat deposits which are full of carbon, those release a lot more carbon dioxide as that soil is plowed and decays, and it's 423 years before you break even. Until then, you're better off just burning diesel than you are burning biofuel as an energy source, better off in terms of its greenhouse gas impact. If you cut down tropical rainforest in Brazil to grow soybeans, which is happening now, and this is only allocating to the biofuel the part of the carbon that's proportionate to the amount of oil in the bean versus the protein in the bean, it's 316 years before you break even on the biofuel part of that equation. The only thing with a very good number at all is taking grassland, this woody savanna, grassland in Brazil, and growing sugarcane for ethanol, where there's only a 17-year carbon debt. That's one where the payback after 17 years might make people decide, well, maybe it's worth having extra releases for 17 years if we can have a big gain for many, many years after that. Otherwise, these length of time to get ahead of all the greenhouse gas released from clearing land is so great that, that it's hard to imagine this will do anything to help us with greenhouse gas issues. And for many of these, we'd be better off burning coal or something like that than burning these biodiesel products. Now, another paper came out in the journal Science last week, the same time ours did, by a guy named Tim Sershinger and his colleagues. And Tim's at Princeton, and the colleagues at a variety of other universities. And this looked at something else. He said, well, let's ask what's happening. There's a global agricultural market. We are using corn that was going into that market to produce biofuels in the United States. When we use corn, there's less corn in the market. The price of corn and other grains that can be used to feed livestock goes up. What happens when the price of grain goes up? Other people plant more of it, a typical economic reality. And some of the people who plant more of it are doing it on land that until then had been a native ecosystem, and they're clearing it. And he has a model done that's been Iowa State has worked on for the last 20-some years. It's called the FAPRI model, but it's a model of the global agricultural economy, which includes all the different kinds of land around the world, how productive they are, how much the land costs, what it costs to clear them, what it costs to fertilize them, what labor costs, all those things for all the countries of the world. And the model predicts, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but the model predicts how changes in something like the price of corn or soybeans would affect agricultural production around the world, including the clearing of land. And when he ran the scenario for how much corn ethanol is projected to occur in the United States about 15 years into the future, through this model, the prediction was there would be enough land being cleared, releasing its greenhouse gases to the air, that for the next 30 years, the net effect on corn ethanol was not that 14% savings that I said there should be, but in fact that corn ethanol for 30 years would release 93% more greenhouse gas than if you had just burned gasoline for those 30 years. Because of this indirect effect. The world, as I said, has markets that are joined together by food, and now with us able to convert food into energy, by energy and food. And what we do in one place influences what happens other places. And if we care about the global impact on the atmosphere, because we all share the same atmosphere, we have to look both at the direct and indirect effects. This has some deep policy implications. I have no idea how to try to implement any rules that might control this. I just can't think of a way that isn't very messy and unlikely to work. Now, this cartoon came out a couple days after both of our papers. Wait, it turns out biofuels may be worse for global warming. Too late, the guy says, as Uncle Sam fills his car up from a subsidized full-service ethanol pump. But what you may not realize from this cartoon, if you read the Energy and Independent Security Act of 2007, there only are subsidies for biofuels made from corn, which is the point that the New York Times editorial made on Sunday, if those biofuels offer at least a 20% greenhouse gas savings, looking at all direct and indirect land use changes. So in fact, if further scholarship supports the work that Searchinger et al. Has done, current biofuels are grandfathered in. Future biofuels made in a way which actually causes land shifts and can't offer 20% greenhouse gas savings for starch-based biofuels would not be covered by the US law certifying them as biofuels. So in fact, Uncle Sam there's not as surprised and dumb as he looks. He actually figured this one out before that paper even came out in the Journal of Science. So what are the alternatives? What can we do when we look at this conflict we have between needing food and energy and needing a global livable environment? Well, number one, I've got to say this. I know it's obvious to all of us, but we need increased energy efficiency. We need to get a lot more done per unit energy, whatever source of energy that might be. And there are many ways, as we all know, that can happen. We need a lot more renewable electric power. The biggest release of greenhouse gases doesn't come from cars. It comes from coal-fired electric plants. Not just in the United States that's true, it's also true all around the world. Turning coal into electricity is an incredibly inefficient thing. Getting electric power from wind, wave, solar, any other way we can get it that doesn't involve burning coal is a huge improvement over what we're doing right now. I'm going to mainly talk about the last two, getting biofuels from various, quote, waste products, which really aren't waste, but can give us much benefit, and then doing something else. I've talked about the trouble with growing biofuels on fertile land where we compete with agricultural crops. I'm going to talk about growing biofuels on other kinds of lands that had been farmed but have been abandoned from agriculture because they no longer are deemed profitable for the farmer. And this has happened to a lot of land, a land mass about half the size of the whole United States, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the UN Environmental Program, has been farmed around the world and been abandoned from agriculture. Because it was farmed, the carbon debt has already been paid. The vegetation was cleared, the soils were farmed, the soils have low carbon content now, the vegetation carbon is in the air. It's already been released. There's a chance to use those kind of lands that I'll show you to grow biofuels in a way that can give us a significant amount of energy. So efficient transportation, bicycle, buy a more efficient car, mass transit. There are some very simple existing technologies that can allow us to use a lot less energy for transportation. You may not realize this, but we release twice as much greenhouse gas from buildings than we do from cars. Now, we don't really release it directly from buildings. We release it because of electricity, which we use in buildings. And so we also use it to heat and cool buildings, but cooling is mainly electricity also, but sometimes heating is natural gas. But if you look at buildings, there are twice as much greenhouse gas coming from them, and there are an incredible number of ways buildings can be more energy efficient, which actually saves the building owner money in the long term. It costs you more, but the payback times are on the order of 5 years for some things like insulation to 15 or 20 years. So more efficient insulation, better windows, more efficient appliances actually save the people who invest in them money, and they save the world greenhouse gases. So there are many architects who work on these issues who assert that it'd be very easy to cut the energy use by buildings in half of what it is right now, and have the people who do that benefit, save money year by year because of that. Wind, wave, solar electricity are all possibilities. Wind is the one that we're on to most right now. There's a lot that can be done with that. There are possibilities with some modern technology which can store energy from windmills in the ground by compressing air and then letting it come out and run generators when you need it, to actually use wind as not just a intermittent source, but a continuous source of energy. And over the next 50 years, we have the possibility of building lots of large windmills like this, which I think look beautiful because they're much better than coal-fired plants. You see it sort of in the low background there in this picture, and can provide a renewable, sustainable source of electricity and minimize the coal. So now I want to step back to actual biofuels. So I want to give you an estimate of what might happen globally. So when we grow corn, we harvest the seed from the corn, and basically everything else goes back on the field. And going back in the field, the rest of the corn plant, which is called the stover, has nutrients in it, which are important. If you remove it from the field, you have to put the nutrients back on as fertilizer. It has carbon in it, which is important in building up carbon in the soil. But there have been quite a few studies, although more are needed, for corn, wheat, and rice to take these residues, straw and stover, and asking how much of them can you remove from a field with minimal impact on the carbon stored in the soil and use them to produce bioenergy. And the estimate is that, as a ballpark estimate, there's about 700 million tons per year. That's about a quarter or so of that above ground biomass that we don't currently use that could be removed. It has to be removed in the right kind of landscapes to prevent soil erosion. There are lots of ifs, ands, and buts about it. I don't know the right number. This is the best estimate I've seen that could be used for biofuels. The same thing is true in forestry operations. You don't want to remove branches with needles on them or leaves because that has a lot of nutrient, and you'd really be affecting the nutrient dynamics balance of those ecosystems. But the branches that are larger than that don't actually have needles and leaves on them, but are too small to be used in traditional forest operations, a slash could be used as a biomass source for bioenergy. And that plus thinnings and other kinds of biomass, including that from trash, are estimated to provide about 900 million tons. And you can convert this into an energy source. You can do it in a variety of ways. The best technology, I think, is not the sort of fancy bioprocessing technologies, converting ethanol by breaking it down, breaking the cellulose down and converting it into alcohol. There's actually off-the-shelf existing technology that works right now. It's gasification, and then turning the gas you get by heating this up and making carbon monoxide and hydrogen out of it into a liquid fuel. The Germans did it in World War II. That's how they powered their army. They didn't have oil wells. They couldn't have even thought of waging a war unless they had the technology to convert coal into a liquid fuel. It's what the South Africans did during apartheid when the world wouldn't give them oil. I'm telling you that the technology of scoundrels could be a good thing. And there's been a great modern twist on this, and that is it's called MTG. It's methanol to gasoline. It actually, unlike the old process, which is called Fischer-Tropsch, this process literally gives you gasoline quality fuel coming out of it, not a mix of long chains that you have to put through an oil refinery to get a final product from. And this ballpark estimate, if you took all that biomass and collected it, and then maybe it's not going to be that good, I think the upper limit we might get is about 15% of global petroleum supply could be provided by these kinds of waste biomass. And that biomass would give you about an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases relative to burning gasoline that it replaces. So I mentioned, though, there's something else. I mentioned that the world has land in lots of different categories, and one of these has already paid this carbon debt price, and that is this 500 million hectares, it's 500 million hectares of land, half the size of the United States, that has been farmed and been abandoned around the world. I don't know how much of that land is really usable in the sense that who owns it and what they're doing on it right now, so all I can give you is an upper bound on what might happen if we use it. I'll show you that in a minute. But I first want to show you what might be done in that land. So you might ask yourself, what would grow on degraded, nutrient-poor soils? Well, if you wander around any part of the landscape around you, you'll see some nutrient-poor soils, some rocky outcrops, some sandy soils, and you'll find native plants growing on them. So it might be possible to take native plants from a region that are adapted to that soil and use them to grow biomass on these soils that are not good enough for growing food crops. Let's just look at that possibility. We did an experiment, not for this reason. We started it before I cared about biofuels. We're looking at it in a more conceptual way at what controls how an ecosystem operates. We're looking at prairie ecosystems in Minnesota. This experiment is about 20 acres in size, and there are 300 some plots there, 150 some of them are in the experiment I'm going to talk to you about right now. These plots were planted with either one species, or 2, or 4, or 8, or 16 different perennial native species from the prairies of the Midwest. So one of the species out here is switchgrass. Another one is big bluestem. There are 16 different species planted out there, about 30 different plots at each level of diversity. And we asked how those influence productivity in the system. And here is the really interesting result. And it's much larger than we ever imagined this when we started this experiment about 12 or so years ago. On this side, here is each of the plots planted to a single species. Here is switchgrass. Any of you heard of switchgrass? Yeah, raise your hand. Yes, okay. Made famous by our president, right? A really good sentence in the State of the Union address talked about getting energy from plants like switchgrass. It really is one very important thing we should do. But one of the reasons I wrote this paper was I didn't understand why switchgrass was chosen, because here it is, it's right there, it's right just on average, it's right in the middle of all these different prairie species growing by themselves. Why didn't we choose the one up here? But it wasn't. This was the one, the chosen one was right there, switchgrass. But if you look at what happened, here is the best thing growing by itself in monoculture. Come right across here, zoom, everything up here. All of those plots planted with 16 species were more productive. In fact, on average, the average plot planted with 16 species gave 238% more energy than did switchgrass or the average species growing by itself in monoculture. A huge premium from biodiversity. If you didn't pay tuition when you entered this room, I won't give you the 2-hour talk on why biodiversity leads to more productivity, okay? But if you want to, you can say afterwards, and it's, I don't know, $100 an hour for each of you. But there have now been over 100 studies like this, experimental studies around the world, asking, does biodiversity really affect productivity? And the answer is yes. On average around the world, this is about twice as high as that. So it's now very clear that having higher diversity leads to higher productivity, and it really says there might be a better way to make some biofuels. We call these low input, high diversity. We never fertilize these. These were grown on very infertile soils, sandy soils, in a county which has the least fertile soils of the state, the lowest hay yields in the state of Minnesota. That's why we have this land, why the university was given this land. No one else wanted it. So we grew this here, and we were really amazed to see this very high effect of diversity on productivity in this field. And so you can take that biomass that I already mentioned. You can take the cellulose in the biomass. Cellulose is a string of sugars. You have enzymes that break them apart into individual sugars. Throw in yeast or bacteria, ferment those sugars to alcohol, distill it, and get a liquid fuel that you can, wherever it comes out here someplace, that you can burn just like we do alcohol right now. This is technology that works in the lab but isn't yet running on a commercial scale. As I mentioned already, the technology that does run on commercial scale is this process of gasifying the biomass under high heat and pressure and making a liquid fuel like synthetic gasoline. A ton of biomass gives you about 75 gallons of synthetic gasoline. So here is what really surprised us. Here is corn ethanol grown on fertile soil. This is the average for corn ethanol grown in the corn belt, the Midwest corn belt. This is how much energy you get, again gigajoules per hectare, from corn. Here's how much energy you get if you take this biomass grown on my highly infertile soils, the worst soils in Minnesota. And I need to tell you this, because we didn't want to have a lot of weeds in our monoculture plots, we bulldozed off the upper 4 or 5 inches of soil to get rid of all the weed seeds that were there. So we got rid of most of the topsoil. And this is still on that soil. This is our real yields, our real energy gain is that. It's about 60 or so percent higher than you get by corn ethanol in very fertile soil, growing a high diversity mixture, no fertilization, very low inputs on these nutrient-poor soils, and converting it by this methane to gasoline synthesis process. So that's one thing. The more surprising thing about this is something else. I'm going to tell you a little bit about soils and their carbon content. If you look at where carbon is, there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. But there is more than twice as much carbon in the soils of the world as there is actually in the atmosphere. The soils are a very large sink, it's called, for global carbon. And how you treat soils determines whether that carbon goes out in the air as carbon dioxide or builds up in that soil through time. Plants have about as much carbon in them as in the atmosphere. So that's sort of where carbon is around the world. What I want to show you is in this experiment, our high diversity plots removed a lot of carbon from the air, some of which went into the roots. Don't forget, prairies have about 3/4 of their living biomass below ground. They're not like a forest where most is above ground. Prairies, most of the biomass is below ground. They make roots and forage for nutrients. They shed the roots. That carbon builds up from those shed roots through time in the soil. And our measurements showed that every year we had about 4.4 tons per hectare, 1.8 tons per acre of carbon dioxide year after year after year in the 10 years of this experiment removed from the air, building up as soil organic matter in that soil. In essence, these high diversity mixtures stored carbon. The monocultures, there was no significant storage. The high diversity mixtures were restoring carbon in that soil. In essence, they were rebuilding the soil they had made in the first place. Prairie made those soils. Prairie was plowed under when it was farmed. Prairie coming back in starts remaking the soil it had made there originally. And when it does that, it replaces the carbon that was lost when that land was farmed. And by our calculations, we will have rates of carbon storage about like this going on, we think, for about 100 years until the soil starts leveling off in its carbon content. It only takes 0.3 tons of carbon per hectare to harvest, to plant this field every year. We plant it once, it grows forever, and to harvest that hay as a biomass, as a bioenergy source. So every year, if you grow prairie like this, high diversity prairie, storing carbon in the soil, and turn it into a biofuel, not only does that biofuel displace the carbon that would have been released from the fossil energy source it replaces, but we have about 4.1 metric tons per hectare of carbon dioxide removed from the air being stored every year as carbon in the soil, which means when you burn that fuel, because of the carbon that's stored in the soil, it's called a carbon negative biofuel. There's actually less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when you're done burning it than there was before you grew that plant to make that fuel. It's not magical. It's because these plants are storing carbon in the soil, rebuilding the soil, a very natural, well-known ecological process. So here are the effects. Here's the greenhouse gas reduction come from corn ethanol. This does not include indirect land use effects. This is my earlier estimate. From soybean biodiesel. And here it is from this high diversity, low input prairie biomass turned into electricity, turned into ethanol, or turned into synthetic gasoline. Huge benefits. About half of each of these bars is the benefit from carbon being stored in the soil. The other half is from displacing the fossil energy source that this takes the place of. So I'm just going to quickly say, growing biomass like this, high diversity biomass on nutrient poor soils with very low inputs, is in fact sustainable. Here are just two graphs that I could find of how unfertilized biomass harvested annually for hay, here for 55 years, here for 90 years, has had its biomass change through time. Even though they were never fertilized, these are not going down. At some point, we have to put some phosphorus or potassium back in the soil, but it's not very much because you harvest it when it's dry, brown at the end of the growing season. Even when you remove it when it's green, like for hay, you still don't have to put much back in. And the nitrogen comes from legumes in these systems, so you don't need to replace the nitrogen. Well, there's a lot of degraded land in the United States. These dots show CRP land. Each dot is 500 acres of CRP. This is not to scale. The dots are bigger than 500 acres on here, so don't get the wrong idea. With about 40 million acres of conservation reserve land that could be used to grow biofuels in the United States, as I said, about 500 million hectares around the whole world. If we took that biomass and could get it all, which we surely can't do, and converted it all into biofuels, it would give us at most 17% of global petroleum use. So in total, 17% here, 15% for the waste biomass case, I think I said. In total, if everything worked perfectly, which I definitely won't do, the most we could get for biofuels would be to replace about 1/3 of our petroleum usage around the world. That's sort of the upper limit. I think realistically it's 10, maybe 15% is what we'll get out of biofuels. It's not the cure-all for our problems. It's a slice of a solution. With 6 billion people on Earth, heading toward 9 billion people, we're not going to have one solution to our energy problems, our food problems, our environmental quality problems. It's going to take adopting lots of different things during the next 50 years, many different ways of doing things, many different ways of living, and so on, which I think, in fact, can give us ultimately a much better lifestyle for us to solve this problem. But I might want to point something out here. We, as a species, have faced lots and lots of problems. I guarantee agriculture was not invented because people had plentiful food easily obtained. Necessity is the mother of invention. Maybe mothers lead to the necessity for invention, but that's a whole other story. But, okay, that's my best joke of the night, too. But if you look here, origin of agriculture, look what happened. Look at the various challenges we face. These are the solutions. We talk about the solutions. I guarantee that the vast majority of them were actually adopted because they were solving a problem we faced. We face problems now. We have solutions to these problems we can adopt. I am incredibly optimistic that we're going to handle the energy, food, environmental sustainability, environmental livability issue just as well as we've handled other problems in our past. I believe that we can have a world that can support 9 billion people living lives as good as ours, not just 50 years from now, but 100 years, 500 years, 1,000. Why not go out 10,000 years? We can go look 10,000 years ago when agriculture was invented. I think we should imagine what the world will be like, what kind of world we're creating for people who will be here 10,000 years into the future. And we are at this point where this very steeply increasing human growth curve is going to finally level off. What we do in the next 50 years as we start leveling off is going to determine what kind of world we have created for everyone else who lives on this world long, long into the future. So I think there is a path toward energy, food, and environmental security. I've tried to suggest some of what this path might be. I think we can get some of our energy, 15% I think might be realistic, from a variety of biofuels that can be made in ways which actually give us environmental benefits, not harms. We can be much more efficient in how we use energy. Being efficient can save us money, as well as helping save, if you will, the sustainability of global climate. We can use other sources of renewable energy. And I would assert that one very important thing I've learned from doing this research is that we really should reserve the fertile lands of the world to meet the projected food demand that we're likely to have in the next 50 or so years. And we should also, as we go forward, consider ways that we can encourage global diets to change toward protein sources that have lower impacts, let's say, than some of them might have. Grass-fed beef as opposed to corn-fed is one very good thing, but there are many other ideas like that. There are lots of little steps that we're going to have to be, decisions we're going to have to be making as a society. But together, these and things I haven't talked about, I believe, have the capability of providing us with a livable, sustainable world with the food supply, the energy supply, and the greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere that we need to keep this planet a livable place. Thank you. Thank you. A question here?
Yes. What do you consider the controls on the world's population that's going to make it level out?
Yeah. It's a good question. The question is what might control global population to cause it to level off? If you study demography of various nations, nation after nation, as people have become wealthier, have undergone what's called a demographic transition. They've gone first from having very high birth and death rates to having death rates fall when public health issues take care of the death rate. And then as education becomes essential to live in a more and more industrialized society, I mean, how long does it take us to become working, effective members of our society? I mean, it took me a long time to get all my degrees to a PhD, and it takes a lot of education. You can't become pregnant at age 13, which you can biologically, and be able to support yourself in our society. To be a member of our society, you actually have to delay reproduction until you have the education to be able to be a meaningful member of society and earn the things it takes to live in the society and provide your children with a chance to have education. That transition toward needing education to be a member of society, and including in that as a transition toward having women become working members of society and them needing education too, is the main factor the demographic studies have shown around the world causes countries to go from having a big difference between birth rate and death rates, where births are very, very high per person, to having birth rates fall down to a sustainable level where in the long term birth balances death and the population levels off. And that transition happens when other countries of the world undergo development. And there's some complaints about international trade and development and issues of the impacts of development. I would personally say those are minor, trivial, compared to the impacts of not letting other nations of the world develop. When they develop, and this is what is happening around the world. As nations are developing, their citizens are making different choices and their population rates are slowing. You can look at graph after graph, these nations coming in, heading toward a level population size. I think it is, I've analyzed a lot of the data myself, done it very differently than demographers tend to do it. I looked at it very ecologically and evolutionarily. I'm convinced that we're going to level off at between 9 and 9.5 billion people. And lots of evidence supports that. Yes?
Is it possible to put that back on the land? And that would be your phosphorus and your potassium.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The issue is what do we do when you gasify biomass? You get the carbon out of it, and the hydrogen, but everything else, the minerals, are left behind. And ideally, you would take it back and put it on the field where you grew the biomass.
Because otherwise you'd be mining the soil
Right.
at some point.
At some point, you'd be mining the soil. And the only reason I think that these studies have shown constant yields and so on, even removing biomass, is that the nutrient content of the biomass is tiny compared to how much nutrients there are when you go down 6 feet, which is how deep these roots go into the soil. Eventually, it's going to become limiting. And so returning that would make a lot of sense. But luckily, you can probably do it maybe in a batch every 5 or 6 years, not have to do it every year. Yes?
You haven't talked about water use efficiency in growing different types of biofuels and the energy costs in water. So if you included water use in growing biofuels, how would that influence the take-home?
Yeah. So the question is, what about water use in growing biofuels? I'm talking about the biofuels being grown in places that are suitable for, if you will, rain-fed production. You can get more biomass by irrigating almost any place. You can get more biomass by fertilizing. I'm using numbers which assume you don't do either one. As we grow more corn, we're actually growing corn in places which need irrigation. If you look at the water impacts of making ethanol from corn, the water needed to process corn into ethanol is pretty small. It's about 3 gallons of water per gallon of ethanol. And with more efficient water capture, which also captures heat and actually makes the ethanol plant more energy efficient, you get it down to about 1 gallon of water per gallon of ethanol. But the huge water impact is coming when people are growing corn in places where corn won't grow without irrigation. There it takes, a recent report of the National Academy of Science says it takes about 1,000 gallons of irrigation water to make 1 gallon of ethanol. And that is happening now using fossil water in the sandhills of Nebraska. Fossil water that's not replacing, fossil in the sense it's disappearing, just like fossil fuel is disappearing. Yes, in the far back. So the question is, the green revolution uses high inputs: nitrogen fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation. Those of you who missed my earlier talk, I talked more about it earlier today. And those take a lot of energy to make. Nitrogen fertilizer is used to make bombs, right? Ammonium nitrate. In fact, the whole process of making ammonium nitrate was invented to make munitions. And at the end of the war, when there's lots of extra capacity, we turned it into fertilizer. So it takes energy to make it. And how will we do that? Well, we won't be using fossil energy is my best guess. Making fertilizer releases a lot of greenhouse gas as it is. You can use any kind of energy you want. You could use wind energy to make fertilizer if you wanted. So it's an unavoidable price of how we're using land right now. And if it weren't for the high inputs, as best we know how to do agriculture right now, we would have a lot lower yields. With lower yields, we'd need a lot more land. In fact, if you look at all the land that is farmable on the world, if yields increase as they have in the past, it would need 900 million more hectares, about the size of the United States. Maybe I said a billion, I rounded up. About the size of the United States to produce that food. If yields don't increase as quickly but slow down 50%, but they still keep increasing, just 50% slower than they did for the last 35 years, we would need about 2.5 billion hectares. We'd basically need all of the land that could potentially be farmed in the whole world just to grow food for people. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen. There's a big question about how we're going to sustain yields even without worrying about fertilizer. But the total fertilizer energy requirement is trivial compared to all the other ways we use energy. I don't think it'll actually be an issue for the world to produce enough fertilizer to grow all the crops we need. There are lots of other impacts of fertilizer. It'd be wonderful to find some better way to do foods than we do right now, in the sense that a lot of the fertilizer leaks into groundwaters and we have problems with it and so on. Those are issues that we really need to look at. But I don't think if we don't have enough energy to make fertilizer, we don't have enough energy to live as a society, anything like what we're living right now. Yes?
Could you comment on the potential of algae as a biofuel? I seem to be coming across this a lot.
Yeah, the question is, what's the potential of algae as a biofuel? There are some species of algae which, when they grow, produce, or when they're near the end of their growth cycle, when they're starting to run out of nutrients and things are getting tough, they fill themselves full of oil. And then you just break them apart, gather that oil, and then put it through a minor refining process, and you have something that replaces diesel fuel. And There was an outbreak of these on a lake in Australia. I've heard this, I've never read it, so this might be one of these scientific urban legends, right? I don't know. But allegedly, it was scooped up and actually put through the local refinery to get petroleum, usable petroleum out of it. And people are trying to grow that in large quantities in ponds, let's say, in an area where they're not using farmland, in deserts with a lot of light and a lot of open land. And they're trying to bioengineer these organisms and have them make even more oil. Now, I have one concern. I hope it can work. And I haven't seen things on a large enough scale to know how well it can work. But if you have an organism that allocates a lot of energy doing something like making oil, it's not allocating a lot of energy doing other things, like making more cells or taking up nutrients. And that makes it a poorer competitor. My PhD research was looking at competition between algae. And the algae that win in competition are not the ones which have these kinds of traits. And so if you have to grow these in large open ponds where algae which can form spores can fly into them, you might not have the things you want in there. You may not have much oil in the long term. You may get a lot of biomass, not much oil. So it works very, very well under highly controlled conditions. I'm not sure if it's going to be able to work under the kinds of open conditions you need to get enough energy to matter. So we'll see. I hope I'm wrong. Yes?
How do you anticipate that climate changes impact your estimates of production on these low-grade soils?
I have no idea. It's a really good question. The question was, how might climate change impact productivity on these low-grade soils? I've looked at, there are a variety of different models that predict climate change at different times in the future. The upper Midwest, where I live, is supposed to be having hotter, drier, well, not actually drier, but hotter, and because it's hotter, greater soil moisture deficits because of more evaporation and evapotranspiration from plants. And water availability influences plant growth, so it could knock it down in that region. I don't know. It's a really good question. I wish I knew the answer. Yeah. Yes? Oops.
Concerns about why population growth is never brought up, and also concerns about small being controlled cities for development and farming. That's farmland in cities like California and all that are being taken over and being controlled. The other question I had was, why do you scrape the soil of these prairie lands when the plants seem that are there were presumably invasives, but also provide energy and go back into that kind of environment?
The question is, why do we scrape off the soil? The reason we did was we were trying to understand in a very controlled experiment what the effect would be of different species. We wanted to make sure we controlled which species were there, and what would be the effect of the number of species. And we couldn't afford to go out and hand weed all the different things that might come out of that seed bank. 20 acres, we had 25 or 30 people just maintaining the experiment as it was, which is every penny I could get to do the work. And we would have taken hundreds if we hadn't gotten rid of those seeds. They might be, right, I agree. It'd be a great experiment to try. It wasn't the one we tried. Yeah, yes?
You looked at the water needed to grow both plants for biofuels and food, because it seems like there's going to be tweaking off the water required at least to get enough energy.
Yeah, the question is, what about the water needed to grow biofuels and food? It's not my area of expertise. There are many experts on this area who are looking at that and trying to project water needs. If you actually look at what happened in the Green Revolution and you look at an analysis of all the different inputs that helped lead to these increases, in many of these analyses I've seen, the number one variable leading to increased production was water. The number two was nitrogen. So it's clear that increasing yields requires water. The sort of approximate take-home message I've heard from people who are more expert on water than I am is they have grave concerns about whether there will be enough water to let us double global food production 50 years from now. I don't know. It's not my area. And I don't like talking outside things I know a little bit about. Yes?
what kind of strength is in terms of government and economics to keep those moving forward?
Yeah, actually, for biomass, whether you want to or not, it costs so much. The question is, what would keep the production of fuels local to avoid the costs and the flow, the cost of transporting them and the outflow of capital from a local community. Because biomass tends to be relatively light, it's pretty expensive to truck it places from where you grow it to where you process it. And most people feel that biomass processing plants that convert biomass into biofuels can be no more than 25 to 30 miles away from where the biomass is grown. Beyond that, the cost of transporting is more profit than the person, the only one making money like this would be the trucker at that point. And so I think they're going to be unavoidably small plants, and even many ethanol plants right now are locally owned. They're owned by local farmer co-ops and so on. I think that that'll be the only logical trajectory to have efficient production of fuels. And if you produce that kind of fuel locally, you'll clearly use it, but you sure better make more fuel locally than you use locally, or you're not going to get any money out of it. You're just buying it for yourself. Yeah.
What do you think would be the reality in tropical regions? Because in tropical regions we have rainforests, so we are not going to have these high yields. We don't have these prairies or that kind of.
Yeah. 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 So the question is, what might happen in tropical countries which don't have prairies? I'm clearly, I'm sorry for something. I didn't try to imply we should go plant prairies every place. I was using it as a case study, saying that in a place where prairie grows, we took some native plants that were fairly efficient at using the limiting resources in that soil, and we planted them. We found that we could get quite a bit of production from them. I would go to a tropical forest, and first I'd want to leave it intact, but if there's a place where there had been forests where you could grow biofuels, land has been cleared and is degraded and could be used, I would try to find local species that are very efficient at living in that soil, that gave you a lot of production, that you could grow in some kind of a rotation cycle and get energy from them, and try that approach. So I would say you're going to have to know your local organisms, your local plant species, which ones could do well under those kind of conditions, and try to find whatever mixtures of those give you the highest yields in those habitats. And tropical forests, actually trees, when I've gone to tropical tree plantations, they really grow quickly. And you want to say people should be able to escape, I bet.
One more question here, Bernie. There you go.
Okay?
I was just wondering if you compare how many gigajoules per hectare you could get out of something else like solar power or something else. Do you have any comparisons?
Of solar power, actually you get a lot more energy from solar. I think solar panels give you, what, 6% or so of the incoming light energy as electricity. And plants maybe give you, by the time you convert them, 0.5%. But plants grow all on their own. And solar panels are incredibly expensive. So it's a lot cheaper energy if you just let the plants grow than if you make all that silicon and lay it across the landscape. And I actually think plants are prettier.